So yeah, I want to talk about enterprise security requirements. You're probably wondering, well, what does he mean by that? Well, we'll dive in here and take a look. So a few platitudes for everybody here in the cloud. It's been a huge success. You know, it's a great business model. You can rent what you need. You don't have to buy it. It simplifies data center management. It's scalable. Does all kinds of good things for you. And it really does have business value. So there are a lot of positive things that can be said for where we are today with cloud. So on those security requirements side, I think first and foremost, as a consumer, I'm always interested in consumer privacy, and I think most of the rest of you are too. That would be a big business driver in using any web-based or cloud-based service. But then we also have to be concerned with various forms of regulatory compliance. And I think that there are, you know, cottage industries that have developed around SOX and HIPAA compliance and PCI as well. So those things are really important to consider, no matter if you're doing it on-premise or in the cloud. There's another set of regulations that's been near and dear to my heart for some time, and that's export regulations. What you might find interesting there is, let's say you have a company here in the U.S., they manufacture a widget and sell that widget to some other company in another country for their use. But in order to support that, you have to grant them access to your technical data. Simply viewing technical data over the web between different countries without an export license is an export itself. So it's something you have to build awareness of into your systems, particularly the cloud-based systems. I know that there are some cloud service providers that do have offerings in this area where if you know you're going to be storing export-sensitive data, they can make sure that it's in the country of your choice to help you comply with those regulations. And that wasn't the end of the security requirements, of course. So intellectual property, it's been a hot topic. You hear it in conferences for the last couple of years. And it's a hot topic because it is very important. You know, it's typically one of the most valuable things that companies have is their IP. So let's take a look at what I would think is a pretty typical kind of use case for intellectual property in the cloud, and that would be in a collaborative environment. So assume you've got two or more companies, they rent out a space in the cloud, they're going to partner up and develop an even better widget. But what each company brings to the collaboration space is called their background IP. That's what they developed on their own. They may not necessarily want to share it with anybody else, or it may be very limited in what they can share, even with their other partners. And then as a result of what they do in that space, it's called foreground IP. And you have to have legal agreements in place to say who owns rights to that, and who should be able to see it, and who should be able to do what with that kind of data too. So you probably can see that there are a variety of legal schemes that need to be translated into access control rules in dealing with intellectual property in the cloud. Moving up to trade secret protection. Trade secrets, different from patents. I mean, I think we're all fairly familiar with patents to a degree. But trade secrets, they only exist and make you money as long as you keep them well guarded. So again, assume maybe a supply chain situation where you need to share a little bit of your trade secret information with somebody else to help build a sub-assembly for your widget. You need to make very, very sure that you don't share any more than absolutely necessary and keep tight controls on that. So this kind of leads me to want to talk about some of the mechanisms of high security and high assurance. You know, we've got NIST 800-63, the level 3s and 4s with that higher level of proofing that we were talking about today. And I think, Mark, that was a really good point, that all the technology in the world doesn't help you as long as you've got good processes behind it to vet that. You know, and then good technology like PKI-based credentials, which can drive us down to, you know, the fine-grained access controls. to be able to accommodate those situations where you do want to share intellectual property or export-sensitive information between companies. You've got to be able to get right down to user group and other kinds of attributes and make decisions, all the way down, in some cases, to need to know. And that's, you know, as far as you can probably go by saying, okay, which people actually need to know this, the rest need to be locked out. So I saw that using pictures was okay today, so I don't feel so bad about this one. I wanted to talk about how authorizations, well, actually a little bit like fashion. So in this case, this is a digital representation of my image and my identity here, this JPEG. And you can figure that out by the biometric. It kind of looks like me if you put glasses on and change the outfit. And this kind of attire is perfectly appropriate for lots and lots of different situations you may encounter in life, like a day at the lake. And it can get you into a lot of different places. But there are other places where it might not be so appropriate to show up in shorts and a Hawaiian shirt. Maybe going to the symphony would be one of those. So, you know, the different kind of wrapper for different situation, different tokens, maybe you could say. So the version of me there in the Hawaiian shirt and shorts, not going to get into the symphony, probably shouldn't even try. But the version there that's dressed up in heavyweight protocols, which shall remain unnamed, can get you into that kind of an environment. And really I want to say, you know, the lightweight versus heavyweight, it really shows up in a case like this. There are lots of places where the lightweight protocols are very appropriate and will get you exactly what you need in terms of assurance and, you know, more than satisfy your business requirements. But there are, and there probably will always be, requirements for some of the heavyweight protocols and more level of assurance type access control schemes. So back to thinking about collaboration. The cloud's a perfectly natural place to think about doing it because, as we've said, you know, the workspaces are easy to set up. Identity management, IDaaS, is maturing, and as you'll see on the next slide, we've got all sorts of interesting ways to connect enterprise identity management systems that exist today with the cloud-based IDaaS systems too. So the lines look a little different than I remember, but it'll be okay. You know, a lot of us work here in the middle, so under enterprise IAM infrastructure, and not to belabor the history of it all, because we've kind of hinted upon that some today too. You know, user identity information repositories like LDAP, Active Directory, perfect place to contain that information, and you know, it met the needs for a long time. Then we have also seen the development of things like single sign-on, web access management, to allow us to scale that out and have much better ease of use and better security for our users who may be trying to access file repositories or lots and lots of different web applications. And even XACML, Extensible Access Control Markup Language Policy Enforcement Points for some of that fine-grained access control we were talking about a minute ago. So we have a lot of this infrastructure that's in place and working well internally and has been for quite some time. We also have fine things like SAML that we've been using for you know, a decade or more now that allow us to have that same kind of single sign-on experience with other users in other domains. And that's also been extended to the cloud. All the various permutations of cloud service providers you know, can accept these kinds of authentication tokens and a variety more also. Here in the middle, lower center, I kind of want to spend a second talking about the possibilities of federated authorization, and what I would like to see develop in the future in that space is to be able to author policies that govern who gets to see the data that you're storing in the cloud, and have that be just about the same type of experience as you would if the information was stored at home. So if you have the ability to write, say, an example policy, you could give that policy to a cloud service provider and have that enforced and demonstrate compliance in that environment as well. And then SCIM, I think, is useful potentially not only just for moving identity information around, but in the just mentioned case of pushing policy information around, I think it could be a suitable candidate for pushing the policy information also between different domains. So Mark and I think probably would be happy I'm using a line graph here. I wanted to show a little, I wanted to show a little bit about, how evolution of access controls has occurred. And this isn't particularly new, but you'll see users were the first things to sort of evolve out of the binary goo decades ago. And then it became reasonable to want to put them into groups, so you can put entitlements or give them entitlements. But even that sort of proved to be insufficient after a while. And we realized, thanks to some of the good people at NIST and other places, that things like RBAC, role-based access control, well, lots of roles sort of flow natural, or lots of entitlements flow from various roles, and that worked pretty well for a while. And then people started realizing, we got more roles than we got users. So then it's like, well, maybe there are other attributes we should be thinking about in making access control decisions. And along comes ABAC, or attribute-based access control, which allows you to make decisions, like in the case of export, on a person's citizenship, perhaps their location, whether or not they have a valid export license. Or in the case of intellectual property, is this person party to a legal agreement that would grant them access to read that technical data? So it's been a much better system, and it works really well, especially in the cases where you need real-time attribute information delivered. People also, I hear PBAC, policy-based access control, and my own way of looking at that is, hey, you can write policies based on attributes. So to end the policy-based and attribute-based wars out there, I decided we should just call it payback. So for policy and attribute-based access control, we took care of it all in one simple word. So about that, we do have, the mature standard of example that has provided for consistent access controls, both in the cloud and on-premise. I think the path for the future is being able to link those better. As I was saying, doing federated authorization in whatever form that may take, I think will increase the ability to do enforcement, improve compliance with your data that's in the cloud. And we also currently have profiles for privacy, export controls, intellectual property controls, and even data loss prevention. And this gives us the opportunity to have interoperability at the transport layer. And lastly, I won't get too deep into this one, but you'll see a slide on mandatory access control methodology. It's something that is coming around again. So in fine-grained auth-Z, I know in this context we tend to focus a lot on subject identity. And with Internet of Things, we're beginning to embrace the idea that all sorts of things will have an identity as well, devices, sensors, SCADA systems, whatnot. And I think that's a really good thing that they're starting to address that. But I don't want anybody to forget that resources or data sort of has an identity too. Or if at the very least, we'll say it has attributes that need to be considered. So that's a key thing in the, say, example reference architecture, where you need to be able to process these four major categories of attributes for runtime access control decisions. And to finish that out, environment, of course, could be, where a person is or where a device is. IP address, time of day, all sorts of different things that you could potentially use that for in actions as well. But there are two major categories of data that we usually hear about, and one's typically easier to deal with than the other. So on the unstructured data side, we have documents, PDFs, text files, XML, things that are full of text that people have written that can be thrown into many different kinds of file repositories. And you can do things with that a little bit easier, I think, in terms of security and access control. On the other side, you've got structured data, things inside databases or applications that have access to that information that's inside a database. And there are a couple of different approaches. I'll talk about that. I also want to toss in a back-end attribute exchange, because I think that's an important consideration for the cloud too, where one domain trusts another domain to provide authoritative attributes for authenticated users. So on the unstructured side, how do we go about doing this? Well, metadata tagging. It's not pretty, but it has to be done. So let's think about creating documents, or maybe you have document stores that are huge already and you have tons and tons of information out there. Once the file is out there in whatever format it's in, there are tools that can perform content analysis for you. So you can read through, maybe define keywords or certain types of information or attachments or objects in the files. If any of these are found, then they should get some sort of, let's call it classification, or at least categorization, so that you then can begin to work with the data objects themselves and use that information to make access control decisions. These tools, for example, some DLP tools will allow you to do this today. There are also some specialty tools that will allow you to do the same thing, programmatically read through file repositories, place metadata tags on it. The beauty of that is once it's in that format, then if it's accessed by, say, an XACTML policy enforcement point, it can read that metadata and then pass that metadata as resource attributes in that reference architecture back to the policy decision point for a decision. Then you can take the requesting user's subject attributes, combine that along with the environment action request, and come up with a decision that would then be congruent with what the policy says. On the policy-based SQL and application proxy side, again, we're looking for layers where we can insert policy enforcement points. And here on the left, we want to be able to talk about data that's stored in SQL databases. So if you have information, not all information is equal, not even all information in the same database that might be in the same row or same column, but sometimes it's those sets of information that actually yield a higher level of sensitivity than the information that's around that. To be able to write a proxy to take XACTML policy and say, this is, whatever you get, these types of result sets, it should be subject to, say, higher level of authentication or something of that nature, sort of a risk adaptive situation to be able to prevent, unauthorized disclosure in that case. Same thing on the web application side. The web app calls maybe an underlying database. That too seems like a great place architecturally to work with, say, web application firewalls or proxies to enforce those policies as well. Because sometimes certain types of application requests or actions might match a policy, and the results of the policy match might be different depending on user environment or the result set that's generated by it. Back-end attribute exchange. So let's say we have, again, sort of a partnership arrangement where one domain trusts another for authoritative attribute information. So user authenticates in domain A, but actually wants to get access to the web app that's hiding over there behind domain B. that kind of sets off an interesting chain of events that domain B knows that domain A is actually authoritative for the attributes for the users that come from there. So rather than duplicating the storage effort, you simply set up this type of a trust arrangement where domain B would then go back and directly query for those attributes. And really, it makes me think that attributes are a little bit like politics. You know, it's all local. So the closer you get to the source of the person's attributes, the more likely they are to be correct. And porting information from one site to another, to another, to another, I think along the way you start degrading and increasing the likelihood that you're getting inaccurate information. This model has been talked about for a couple of years, but I think that now, especially with the cloud paradigm, this is something that we'll see more of in the future. So I do want to take 1 second and talk about MAC, mandatory access control. I'm sure you're all familiar, at least through spy movies, with, you know, unclassified, confidential, secret, top secret. I'm not necessarily suggesting that governments want to move everything out into the cloud, but I do want to say that there are commercial analogs to this. There are different levels of sensitivity that companies would like to place on documents. On the unclassified side, you might call that public domain. You know, and you see you kind of go up the scale by going down the list. Something confidential, maybe it's okay to share with your partners, depending on how your company defines it. Maybe you share it with partners, suppliers. Competition sensitive, well, you want to keep that out of the hands of certain people. Maybe you've got a final tag down there like limited distribution, and what that means is only executives can see this, or only the finance team should be able to see this. So again, you see that there's a need for this mandatory access control methodology beginning to evolve in real life scenarios today. So to start wrapping up a bit here, I want to talk about a couple of things that are both present and future. The standardized auth-in and auth-z mechanisms that we have do promote consistent enforcement and compliance monitoring and reporting. I think we need to see additional integration with SIM tools, security incident and event management, for real-time alerting, for the sake of people like your incident responders. You know, you've got your data distributed across on-premise infrastructure as well as in various cloud sites, to be able to not only control access to that, but know if there's been a potential breach or some suspicious activity. That needs to flow back to people inside your own company who might manage that. And I know that there are some vendors that are offering some nascent possibilities in that area today, and I would imagine that's going to grow. And then lastly, integration with GRC, or for the identity governance and access reconciliation, for executives and compliance managers to be able to have a not necessarily single pane of glass, but the ability to get information in fairly real time about issues that may be out there in terms of access attempts or things like that. Have that flow into, you know, the current deployment. I think it's going to be really important for execs and again, compliance managers in that area too. So in conclusion, to answer the question I asked, yeah, you know, I think a lot of providers are offering solutions in most of these areas today. There's probably room for improvement. I doubt anybody's, you know, real hard over into the mandatory access control thing right now, but you know, you never know. But really, cloud service providers, I think, will capture a lot more customers with these kinds of offering. There are places where, again, you can wear your shorts to the leg, but you know, there are customers out there that could probably be wooed by the heavyweight protocol, high assurance environment type stuff. So I would think that as cloud service providers move into those areas, they'll be able to find more business opportunity there. And then lastly, keep those resources in mind. They're not necessarily identities, but their attributes make a really big impact on access control decisions. Any questions?
Questions? So, well, first, thanks, John. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
All right. How you doing, Dave?
This is Devrim Ünal from Turkey. I'm working in a government organization. I want to ask you the question. You spoke about that cloud service providers will capture more customer, like government customer with high security service offerings. But what about trust issue, especially things like privacy and access to information of the customer? What do the CSPs do in this area? That, for example, that the cloud service provider doesn't have the access to the customer information, provides isolation and segregation of information, and so on.
I think it's a good point. I can't speak on behalf of cloud service providers and what they're doing. Anybody else want to take that up with an example of how cloud service providers are trying to ensure privacy for applications that are hosted in the cloud?
I think that's a question over a couple of beers, is what I'm thinking.
Good question, though.
Yeah, it was a great question. Anybody else have a question for John? Well, awesome.